Today, the chairs of 4 committees in the Democratic-controlled House put out a statement criticizing President Trump's Treasury Department for lifting sanctions this past weekend on companies linked to a Russian oligarch named Oleg Deripaska, even as Deripaska and his family and his associates will definitely still own a majority stake in those companies. The Democrats are also asking Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, hey, what was the rush with lifting these sanctions? They asked Mnuchin to give them a little more time to review this deal in light of the holidays and the government shutdown happening right after the deal was announced. Mnuchin, though, said no, they couldn't have any further time. And now, apart from the Democratic committee chairs raising these concerns, a member of the House Intelligence Committee is raising another major red flag, which will curl your hair. Congresswoman Jackie Speier has just sent this letter to Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin asking about reports of Mnuchin's, financial relationship with a business partner of Oleg Deripaska, a business partner of Deripaska who owns a big stake in Deripaska's companies and who will benefit from this lifting of sanctions on Deripaska's companies. Congresswoman Jackie Speier is asking Mnuchin to please explain his business dealings with a Soviet-born American billionaire named Len Blavatnik. Congresswoman Speier called Mnuchin's involvement in deciding to lift these sanctions when that will have a financial effect on Len Blavatnik, quote, a deeply troubling matter and a conflict of interest. And that's a big deal allegation, right? Saying a Treasury Secretary had a personal conflict of interest in a matter like this. Treasury has answered this charge twice. Check this out. The Treasury Department acknowledges that Mnuchin and Blavatnik do know each other personally, though as for the reporting last year that Mnuchin, quote, frequented Mr. Blavatnik's yacht before becoming Treasury Secretary, the Treasury Department insisted today that is not true. They said today that Mnuchin attended only one party on Blavatnik's yacht. Thank you very much. That's not many parties. That's just one party. And the Treasury Department told the New York Times this afternoon that Mnuchin and Blavatnik had, quote, no business relationship, though by this evening, in a follow-up response, that had become, quote, no direct business relationship. Important revision there. Right, got it. You sure that's the last one? Tonight, the Times reports that Len Blavatnik's company may have already made something like $800 million just from the lifting of sanctions this weekend. With the involvement of a Treasury Secretary who partied on that guy's yacht, but just the one time, just once. No direct business relationship, but maybe a business relationship. Astonishing allegations from Congresswoman Jackie Speier. She joins us next. California Congresswoman Jackie Speier has been quoted on this show tonight twice already. First for her comments today that unspecified witnesses from the Trump Organization who have testified before the House Intelligence Committee may have a problem legally in terms of potential liability for lying to Congress. Also, Congresswoman Speier has started a bit of a firestorm over allegations she has now made concerning Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin and the possibility that he may have had a financial conflict of interest when it came to his decision to lift sanctions on a Russian oligarch named Oleg Deripaska and businesses associated with him. Joining us now is California Congresswoman Jackie Speier. Congresswoman, thank you very much for being with us. You have been like you have been the table of contents to our show this evening.
Thank you.
Let me ask you first to tell us what your concern is about the possibility that the Treasury Secretary has a financial conflict of interest with the lifting of these sanctions.
So Steve Mnuchin sold his interest in his Rat Pack Hollywood studio to Leonard Blavatnik. Leonard Blavatnik is a significant shareholder in Rusal, which is Deripaska's company. That company, once sanctions were first imposed, dropped like a stone. Once the sanctions were lifted, it increased by some 24% in terms of the stock price. I think very strongly that Secretary Mnuchin should have recused himself, or certainly should have asked the ethics office whether or not he should have been involved in the negotiations on the sanctions relative to Deripaska and the lifting of those sanctions.
Since you have been pressing the Treasury Department on this, have you been able to get with any clarity, any sense of whether or not he did seek ethics advice or whether his potential recusal was ever evaluated by the department?
So that question is posed in the letter that I've sent to him, and we haven't received a response yet. You know, what's most concerning about all of this, Congress passes legislation imposing sanctions last July. 9 months pass and nothing happens, and we start complaining about that. Then all of a sudden, there are sanctions imposed on Deripaska and his companies, except they're postponed. They're postponed for more than 30 days, which is normal. They're postponed until September. And that allowed Deripaska to do all kinds of things relative to his ownership interests. So for all intents and purposes, the sanctions were only in place for about 4 months.
The thing that is striking from an outsider's perspective, and as somebody who's not an expert on these things, is just that Deripaska seems to be such a dangling thread when it comes to the Mueller investigation, when it comes to his relationship to, just for example, the president's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, whose criminal case is still ongoing. It seems like an odd time for the U.S. government to be taking steps related to Deripaska that would have such a massive financial impact on him. Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, a backbench senator, has suggested that since these sanctions were lifted, maybe the Senate might have a little buyer's remorse with passing up the opportunity to block the Trump administration from lifting these sanctions. Is this the sort of thing that could be revisited, that could be undone?
I think you probably could undo this. Certainly the House voted overwhelmingly to not lift the sanctions. The Senate was only 3 members short of also confirming that the sanctions should not be removed. So I think there's a means by which we could reinstate those sanctions.
Congresswoman, I also wanted to ask you about your assertion today to my colleague Katie Tour that people who testified before the House Intelligence Committee from the Trump Organization may have trouble when it comes to potential legal liability for lying to Congress. And I know that you can't talk about exact details of testimony that happened behind closed doors, but can you tell us if you feel like those matters will be followed up, whether those transcripts, for example, will ultimately be conveyed to Robert Mueller or otherwise be adjudicated the way they need to be?
So the transcripts, it is certainly the intention of the committee to make those transcripts available to the special counsel. They have to be reviewed for any classified information that cannot be released. But that certainly is the long-term interest. I also think that it's very important for the Intelligence Committee to be reorganized. And unfortunately, Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans are slow-walking the appointment of their representatives on the committee, which is frustrating our effort to get started.
Congresswoman Jackie Speier of California, thank you so much for being here tonight, ma'am. It's nice to have you here. All right, we'll be right back. Stay with us.